Yiboneh, Yiboneh HaMikdash, Yitzion, Yitzion, Yitzion Temaneh. Yiboneh, Yiboneh, Yiboneh HaMikdash, Yitzion, Yitzion, Yitzion Temaneh. Neshama shir chadash.
Shalom Aleichem. Welcome home to Torah. A warm welcome home to Torah. We are in the Eretz Chemda Beit Midrash. We're in Parshat VaYigash, and I just want to say a few words before we start. As you know, this is the end of the fiscal year, and of course, Yiboneh is doing so much, and we'd like to let you know, of course, that you could donate your contributions as end of year tax deductible donation, at least in most countries, not in Israel, but we will use your donations to continue to do chesed, right? What's going to save the Jewish people? Torah, avoda, and gomel chesed, and that's one of the major things that every Jew seems to be involved with right now, and it's unbelievable, meaning it's believable how much chesed, and right now we are in the, I call it the war room, the control room here, with the front lines, making tzitzis for the Chayalim at Eretz Chemda, and they're very instrumental in helping us distribute the tefillin that we're collecting. So far, we've already donated, or through the kind contributions, 30 pair of tefillin, and we got another 10 coming next week. B'ezrat Hashem. Okay, so with that, we're going to start with Parshat VaYigash, chapter 47. We're going to deal with two verses. So for those who are unfamiliar, we are explaining the Parsha according to the Yakar's explanation. You can find the Hebrew sheets. You won't find pretty colors like this. You'll just have black and white to deal with. But on the website down below, by the way, the link to make contributions is down below as well. And previous classes, you can also find links down below in the description box. So before we begin, let me just ask a question. When we understand, in terms of giving charity, tithes, even the word tithe, which is obviously from a Greek or Latin derivative, it means a tenth. But when we give ma'aser, in Hebrew, ma'aser also means 10. However, the halacha is, one should not give less than a tenth, and one should not give more than a 20th. A fifth, which is 20%. So between 10 and 20%. However, lichachila, the best case scenario is one should actually give up to close to 20% as they can. And we're going to see it. And it's an amazing concept, because in this week's Parsha, chapter 47, verse 23, this is Yosef said to the people, "Behold, I bought you and your farmland today for Pharaoh." Let me just give you some background. So there were 7 years of plenty, right? We know Pharaoh's dream, and Yosef interpreted it. 7 years of plenty, and they were going to save as much as they could, and therefore they would have, for what? For the years of famine, enough. Okay, so what happened was, once the famine began, and people ran out of food, because it was a famine, nothing was growing. So people needed food. So they went to Yosef, who was the viceroy, the COO, right? The chief, how would you call it? Not the operating officer, sorry. The financial officer, right? Chief financial officer, CFO, is that how you call it? And he did something amazing. He said that if you want food, you have to buy it. And he basically made all the Egyptians mishubad, subservient to Pharaoh. In other words, he bought them and their property. I bought you and your farmland today for Pharaoh. That's what he did. Smart man. And he says, this is in Hebrew, he says, "Behold, you have seed." In Hebrew, hey lechem zera. Really, the word hey is very unusual. It should say hine. Hine, behold, I'm giving to you seed. Okay, that's what hine means. And Rashi says that's what he means. Hey is equivalent to hine. But it says hey. What's hey? 5. Okay, it's going to be significant. And it shall be concerning the props that you shall give a fifth to Pharaoh. In the Hebrew, Haya betvua unatatem chamishit leparo. Right? You're going to give 1/5 to Pharaoh. V'arba hayadot yelechem lezera. But you know what's going to be? The other 4/5, the other 4 parts, they're going to be for you to seed your fields in the future, for your food, and for those in your houses, and for your young children to eat. Okay, so the Yakar, based on this verse, where it says, Hey lechem zera, if you look on page Reish Yud, which is page 1, according to the people on my email list that got it, it's 210. At the very bottom, there's 2 small paragraphs. The Yakar says, Noson lehem zera al chamei shanim asher hayu royim liot shnei ra'av. So what actually happened was this, that when Yaakov came down to Egypt with the brothers, right, it was in the 2nd year. 2 full years have passed that there was the famine was already in actuality. When Yaakov came, what happened? The famine ended. The famine ended. We're going to see why. It's Genesis 45, verse 6. This we know, this is right before Yaakov comes down, right? And we're talking about Yosef has revealed himself to his brothers. Obviously, Yaakov is coming down right away. It says over there, we said it's 45, verse 6. For these 2 years, the hunger year is in the midst of the land. And yet there are 5 years in which there shall be neither plowing nor harvesting. So keep in mind that when Yaakov comes down, the famine ends. So it's only 2 years of famine. Those 5 years they expected to be part of that 7-year dream of a famine never took place. And that's because Yaakov, the tzaddik, comes. And we're going to explain it in a second. I want to go back into the Yakar because we're only 1 line in. It says like this, Hey lechem zara. Right? The word hey, we already explained, is out of place. It should say hine. So the word hey is actually instructive of 5. For what? So he gave to him, Noson lehem zera al chamei shanim. So Yosef, as the viceroy, is giving to the Egyptians actual seed, for they can plant those 5 years. Keep in mind that if there's a famine, you're only going to give them food. You're not going to give them seed. The seed is for when the famine is over. Okay? And those 5 years, he gave them seed for those 5 years. Upasak hara b'schut Yaakov. Keep in mind that the famine actually ended once Yaakov arrived in Egypt. And I have here in number 2, the Midrash in the Sifri 38:8. It just mentions wherever a tzaddik goes, wherever the righteous go, blessing comes in their wake. Just for modern history, when the Jews started coming back to the land of Israel, the land began to blossom. For all those, 1800, 1900 years that the Jews have been slowly out of the land and slowly coming back, the majority of those years we were not here in Mass, that it was very difficult to grow anything. It's only the last 150, 200 years that the land has really animated itself, has awoken. That's real woke, okay? We're going to use the word woke appropriately. The inanimate object called the land has awoken. So Israel went down to Gerar in Genesis 26:12. A blessing came to Gerar. By the way, that happens to be Gaza. Next, it says in Genesis 30, verse 27, when Yaakov went down to Lavan, it said, we understand that a blessing came in his wake. Also, when Yosef went down to Potiphar, a blessing came down to him too. Look at chapter 39, verse 5. And of course, what we're dealing with here, if you look in Genesis 47:10, it says, regarding Yaakov coming, it says, and the Lord, actually 39 verse 5, the Lord blessed the house of, okay, that was with Potiphar. They were blessed, 39 for verse 5. But here in 47:10, it says that when Yaakov went down to Pharaoh, blessing came down for his sake. It says in the text that Yaakov blessed Pharaoh. In what way did he bless him? in the years of famine were withheld from him. Okay, so that's the point. The psak, the break of the famine happened when Yaakov came. Now we understand why it says, Hey lechem zera, when Yosef is saying to the Egyptians, I'm giving to you seed, hainu al chamesh shanim, because the word hey, it could have said hine, but it says hey aleph, meaning the 5 years, I'm giving you 5 years worth of seed. Now here's something very Kabbalistic, Mukubalim Amru, right? The mystics have said, Shemin Hey Achrona Shebeshem. There's 4 letters in the Yud Kei Vav Kei. There's 2 Heys. First of all, the Yud and the Vav are masculine, the Heys are feminine. There's going to be obviously something to do with fertility and a mass production, let's just say. So basically, from the last letter Hey of the name Yud Kei Vav Kei is Nimshechu Kol HaToladot the Kol Davar Oisei Pri. Anything that is productive and multiplicity comes from that Hey in God's name. Ukedei liyot hadavar lezikaron. In order for it to be mentioned and as a remembrance, or maybe for the record, in other words, this is something that we have to know. Ready for this? Tziva lehem sheyitnu hachomesh leparo. That's why God commanded, right? It was commanded to them by Yosef. Yosef commanded to them to give 1/5 to Paro, which is 20%, whereas they would keep the other 80%, the other 4 parts would be for them. As I mentioned from the beginning, that even though we think of tithing as 10%, it's really 20%, and we'll talk about it now. V'od remez, v'yesh od remez. There's another hint to this idea. Shekol zeyeh b'schut Yaakov. That everything here, all of the stopping of the what of the famine was on account of Yaakov. But what were they able to eat? They also ate on account of Yaakov because we'll hear a second. K'moshe Yaakov lo achal mikol asher lo kim aru yadot. Yaakov already taught Yosef this important lesson of giving tithes above 20%. Yaakov himself he himself would not eat more than 4/5. He would always give what? Chele chamisha hifrish l'gavoa. He would always apportion 1/5, 20% to Hashem. And we see this in Genesis 28, verse 22. I have here on the source sheet, number 3, right? This is Yaakov. Then this stone, which I have placed as a monument, shall be a house of God, and everything that you give me, right? That means all my income, all of the gifts that ever come to me, I will surely tithe to you. Now that's what it says in English. But in Hebrew it says, V'chol asher titein li, all that you give to me, God, aser esarenu l'cha. Lach, which means it's a double language. You can translate as I will surely tithe, or I will tithe twice because of the double language. Now, I want to just mention about this double language, yes, but the root is aser, but osher, ashurut, wealth, is the same root. And therefore, this is a guarantee for wealth. As we started off by mentioning, if you want to contribute, now's the time to contribute to any type of charity, but Yiboneh is doing tremendous work, and if you want to call me or write me and find out how you can participate, we'd be happy to hear from you. But this is something that we want to do. We want to make sure that we give back to Hashem, and this word, Aser Asirenu, that's Yaakov set in motion this double tithe, and we're going to find out that you can actually test God. Right? We don't test God. You're not supposed to test the Lord your God. But there's one place where you can, and that's with your tithing. And we're going to see right now, I believe, how we get there. So it says like this. We're talking about this verse, 28-22 in Genesis. The Yakar at the top of the next page says, Shnei ma'asrot. That means 2 tithes. The isora batra, the isora kama demei. So basically, you're actually able to give 20% because of the gift of receiving so much. So in other words, if I give 10%, or whatever it is, of 100, that's only 10. But if I give 10% of 1,000, that's 100. So the more I give, the more I can continue to give. So these languages in Aramaic, that the 10% at the end is because of the 10% at the beginning, but it says dame, meaning it's similar. It's exactly the same. You're going to give a second 10% of what you gave to begin with. Hainu ha-chomesh, which is the word chomesh, which is 1/5. Okay, which is 20%. Kakol ha'oichlim b'schuto hitil aleim natina zu. So all that he merited, Yaakov himself merited. Here, maybe we're talking about the Egyptians. Remember, Yaakov set it in motion. So all that they, plural, ate was in the merit of the fact that they gave. Sheyochlu rak arba yadot v'afrishu chomesh. That they would be able to consume the 4/5 only because they separated the 1/5. Now, what do we find? In the very beginning of the Ra'av, the beginning of the famine, V'chein betchilat ha'ra'av, it says in chapter 41, verse 34, you'll find this, number 6 on the source sheet. It says over there, this is, let Pharaoh do this, and appoint officials over the land, and prepare the land of Egypt during the 7 years of plenty. Where do we get the word prepare in this Hebrew verse? It says, V'chimesh et eretz Mitzrayim. The preparation for the blessing comes from the giving of the 5th. You give your 20%, you'll have plenty in return during the years of plenty. Now, the word chimesh also means prepared. I mean, it literally means prepared. Because we know that when the Jews went up from Egypt, they went up armed. Many people translate trained. And Rashi even says it's zariz. Zariz means ready and prepared, ready to go. So you prepared the land by giving the 5th. This idea that Yosef instructed them to give a 5th to Pharaoh and the clergy and whatever, and through that they would be blessed. But the Yakar continues, and he says after these words, "V'chimesh es eretz Mitzrayim," right? You shall prepare the land. Shalokach mikulam chelech hamishi, that they're going to collect from all the Egyptians 1/5, 20%. Kisham tziva Hashem habracha, because it was there that God Himself commanded the blessing. He commands the blessing when you give your 20%. And where do we see that in the Torah itself, that you're commanded? That's in Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 22. It has the same double language we saw already. It says, Aser ta'aser et kol tavua zarecha. Right? You shall surely tie. That double, forget the English, right? You shall surely tie. It's a double language. Aser ta'aser. 10, you should give 10, which means you should give 10 twice. Okay? And then he says again, Shnei ma'asrot. There's 2 types of ma'asrot. The truth is, it's actually linked to how we have to give ma'aser. In the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, it just mentions that the same thing you give for your grains, you give for your flocks. The same thing you give for your flocks, you give for your grains, and therefore you give twice. But this is another lesson that we learn about giving 20%. And now, drum roll please. V'bo mutar l'nasot et Hashem. From here we learned what? That you're allowed, not just allowed, it's permissible, right? I think permissible and allowed are the same. It's mutter to test God. As we say in Malachi, this is the last of the prophets, chapter 3, verse 10. Bring the whole of the tithes into the treasury so that there may be nourishment. It's number 9 on the source sheet. In my house. And test me now therewith, says the Lord of hosts, to see if I will not open for you the sluices of heaven and pour down for you blessing until there will be no room to suffice for it. Ad belidai, without any restrictions, without any gvul, without any limit. Yeah? And you're allowed to test Hashem. The Navi says it. The prophet says it. We're not talking about somebody made it up. This is the real deal. This is the only time you're allowed to test Hashem, specifically with the tithes. That's what it says. Heviu et kol hamaaser el beis ha'oitzer. Okay? Okay, so now we're in chapter 20, the same chapter, 47, but now verse 27. And just keep in mind, in Hebrew it says, V'yeshev Yisrael be'eretz Mitzrayim be'eretz Goshen v'chulei. Right? And Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen. And the rest of the verses, and they acquired property in it, and they were prolific and multiplied greatly. Okay, so v'yachazu bo, they had many holdings, like real estate holdings, v'yipru v'yirba ma'od, and they increased greatly. Now, keep in mind, we did discuss this idea of the Yeshev Yaakov, right? We didn't hold that was such a great thing. Do you remember in the Yeshev, we discussed this idea that dwelling permanently in this land, doesn't matter what land, in this world, on this earth, is not a good thing. We are passers-by. We are renters. We are not the owners. This land, this world, let me just get that straight. This world is a prus door. It's an entranceway to the next world. So here the Yakar mentions Kol HaPasuk Zeh, this whole verse, in verse 27, that Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the land of Canaan, they acquired property, and they had so many. He goes into great detail how this is actually Ashmat B'nai Yisrael, hu medaber, that the pasuk is not saying such great things about the Jewish people. In fact, there's a guilt, right? What's the word Ashmat? Esh Asham. There's a guilt here. What's the guilt? Kadosh Baruch Hu is Gozer Aleim. Remember back in the Brit Bein HaBetarim, in the covenant between the parts, in chapter 15 of Genesis, verse 13. We have that here. Number 11. He said to Avram, you shall surely know that your seed will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and they will enslave them and oppress them for 400 years. So they're supposed to be gerim, wanderers, not settling in a permanent fashion. But we discussed back then, we're talking about the attitude of non-permanence in this world, as opposed to what Yaakov sought was shalva, was some kind of, what's the word? Tranquility. Hema bikshu liot toshavim b'makom shenigzar aleim gerut. That what the problem is that they, the Jewish people, sought to be toshavim. I mean, God said, at least regarding Egypt, you're going to be a stranger in a strange land, at least during that 400-year period, or in this case, 210-year period, to remain as foreigners, as aliens, as strangers, as wanderers. But they sought, because it says, V'yeshev Yisrael. Yisrael dwelt in a permanent way. They sought to dwell in a place that they should have been like Gerim, Gerut. And that we see in the Midrash by Yaakov, 37. No, it's Breshit Rabbah 84:3. I'll just read the beginning, right? When the righteous live in tranquility and seek to live in tranquility in this world, the accuser comes and accuses them. He says, is this what is prepared for them in the world to come not sufficient for them? That they seek to live in tranquility in this world? Know that it is so. Yaakov, our patriarch, because he sought to live in tranquility in this world, was confronted by the accuser regarding Yosef. As we know, then Yosef was sold, and Yaakov was basically awoken to the travails of this world and experienced a lot of pain. Okay? So he was looking for tranquility. God took that possibility away from him. We discussed it back then, a few Parshiot ago, that basically it was like two sins involved. The sin of Lashon Hara on Yosef's part, which was not sufficient for him to be punished because he wasn't of age. He was still 17, and you're not punished in heaven until you're 20. And Yaakov's seeking tranquility, it was just a combination thereof that kafza, jumped forward the rogesh of Yosef, because it shouldn't really have happened until Yosef was 20. But it happened forward, and that's what he says right now. Bikesh liyeshe b'shalva, right, we're 4 lines down in that paragraph. He sought to dwell in tranquility. Kafza, jump forward. in time, because he was only 17. He really wasn't held accountable in heaven, but God saw fit that it should jump forward. The Ragzu Shal Yosef. Okay, Kaka Pasuk. So our verse here is Ma'ash Imam al Yeshiva Zu. It's attributing guilt, something that liable for this settlement of the Jewish people in Egypt in a seeking in a permanent way, because the verse says, Shebikshu achiza ba'aretz lo lehem. They sought real estate holdings in a land that wasn't theirs. V'lo kach amru el paro. Well, here's like a rhetorical question. 1 second. When we first came down to Egypt, is it not that we told Paro? Look in Genesis 47, verse 4. That you'll find number 14. And they said to Pharaoh, we have come to sojourn in the land. Lagur be'eretz banu. We came just to be gerim. So that's true. That's when we first came down. But what, in that same verse towards the end? Now please let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen. V'yata yeshvuna, let us dwell, let us settle in the land of Goshen. Milamed, what does this teach us? Shemitchila lo yardu lishtakei shama. That at the very first moment they went down, they had no intention to settle there. Ela lagor, as they said. Kimidayer be dayara, like someone who's renting an Airbnb, right? V'yakshav chazru midivreihem. Here they retracted, they went back on their words. The kol kach nishtaku shama, and they became, wait till you hear this. I mean, I feel for our brothers and sisters in countries like America and other places that are very comfortable or tranquil. Well, maybe not anymore. I don't know. But they became so comfortable in Egypt. We became so comfortable in Egypt. The kol kach nishtaku shama. We mamish invested. We sunk deep down into Egypt. Ad shelo rotzo litzeit mitzrayim. Till we didn't even want to leave. Now you got to be sitting down. If you heard this, you already know it. But if you never heard this before, until the point that God had to yank us out with a strong hand. He had to pull us out. It's almost hard to even say and to read and then tell over, but this is the truth. Those who did not want to leave Egypt, Mesu b'shloishes yemei afela. I'm going to tell you the numbers. It's unbelievable. 4/5 of the Jews died in Egypt during the 9th plague of darkness. Why the 9th plague of darkness? First of all, it's as close to 10 as you can get. But this is the plague where the Egyptians couldn't see. For 3 days, they couldn't even move. It was so thick. The darkness was so thick, it could be felt. Okay, it could be felt. And, wait till you hear this. Why was it during that plague? Because Rashi explains, actually. Maybe I'll just say it outside first. Unbelievable. If the Egyptians would see Jews die, they would say, all those plagues mean nothing. They affected the Jews just as much as it affected us. We have no lessons to learn here. But when things are directed specifically at the Egyptians, and the Jews are not affected by it, so then hopefully they would learn their lesson. So God covered up. It had to be that those Jews who were not going to leave were going to be taken care of, so to speak. They're going to be dead and buried before the light comes up. So during those days of darkness, they died and were buried, and the Egyptians knew no difference. They didn't know where these 4/5. Now think about it. If there were 3 million Jews that left Egypt, and 4/5 died, you do the math. We're talking a lot, more than the Holocaust. It was a Holocaust. This was a Holocaust. Rashi says over there, the thick darkness in which they did not see each other for those 3 days, and another 3 days of darkness twice as dark as this, so no one rose from his place. If he was sitting, we're talking about the Egyptians, he was unable to stand. If he was standing, he was unable to sit. Now, why did God bring darkness upon them, meaning the Egyptians? Because there were among the Israelites in that generation Wicked people. Do you understand what wicked means? You don't want to be a part of the Jewish people's destiny. That's a new definition. Is that a new definition? No. But for us, that's a new definition. Who did not want to leave Egypt. They died during the 3 days of darkness so that the Egyptians would not see their downfall and then say, they too are being smitten like us. Also, the Israelites searched the Egyptians' dwellings. By the way, God said, ask your neighbors for their gold. And on the 10th plague, the night at midnight at the 10th plague, when we finally went out to collect the gold, go ask your neighbors for their gold, because we left with a lot of gold as we were promised, as Abraham was promised. So when we went to them and they say, I don't have any gold, or witches, or gems, we say, what do you mean? Like 3 weeks ago, during that 9th plague, we were walking around your house. We know where everything is. We know behind this bookcase and behind that, whatever. We know where everything is, so you can't tell us you don't have it. So it says, when they were leaving Egypt and asked for some of their things, and the Egyptians said, we have nothing. The Israelite would say to him, I saw it in your house. It's in such and such a place. Okay. Now, so we're going to continue on with the Yakar. This is the very last paragraph. V'yomer. Am I correct? Yeah. It says, V'yirpu v'yirbu ma'od. They were fruitful and multiplied greatly. This is going back to verse 27. Now, this Parsha, the following Parsha is a closed Parsha. It's like the only one that's entirely closed. What's a closed Parsha? A closed Parsha, okay, remember those old typewriters? Basically, you're typing away and you want to do a new paragraph. So you hit enter, new paragraph. But if you want to just make a space, you could hit tab. Tab is like usually set for whatever you want to set it for. But let's just say in the Torah, there's a closed Parsha that's usually 9 letter spaces. So you'll notice some of the paragraphs begin on a new line. That's called an open paragraph. And some of the paragraphs begin on the same line. It's a 9-letter space. This Parsha coming up, V'yechi Yaakov, V'yechi, is no letter space, meaning just 1 letter space. It's not an obvious new paragraph. And it's talked about, and it's known that this is the only Parsha that has a totally closed, which really means it's like you read it as one sentence then. So they greatly multiplied, and Yaakov lived. Listen to what he says. Ramaz b'smichut zu. There's a hint to the juxtaposition of the next Parsha, V'yechi. Lama sha'amru, to what the rabbis said. Drum roll, please. Yaakov lo meis. Right, just like Am Yisrael chai. Oda vinu chai, Oda vinu chai. Steve, I won't torture you. So Yaakov lo meis. Yaakov did not die. Umaksha. 1 second. Doesn't the verse tell us that he died and he was embalmed and he was buried? How can it be? How can it be? How can it be that he didn't die? The Gemara asked, Mitaretz. So there is a verse in Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 10. Where are we? Here it is, number 21. Oh, just by the way, just so you should know, in chapter 50 of Genesis, verse 2, and Yosef commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father, and the physicians embalmed him. But there's also a verse that explains much further that all this was done. Okay. So what's going on? This verse in Jeremiah says, and you fear not my servant Jacob. So obviously the prophet Jeremiah is speaking about, when he says my servant Jacob, he's talking about Jacob, but he's also talking about Israel. Says the Lord, and be not dismayed, O Israel. But it does give reference to my Avdei Yaakov. And then right away it says, for behold, I save you from afar and your seed. So if God's going to save the seed of Jacob, he's going to save Jacob too. It says, I'm going to save you and your seed from the land of captivity. So this is a reference to Yaakov being saved and his seed being saved. So, Al tira avdi Yaakov v'chulei ki hine Moshiach merachok Vetzarecha meretz shivyam. So, Makish hu lazaro, there is a connection between Yaakov and his seed. Ma zera b'chaim, just as his seed, or whenever his seed is alive, which we are the seeds of Yaakov, we are alive. Afhu b'chaim, so too he is alive. Umakshim kan, so we can ask here, 1 second, wasn't he embalmed and buried? So that doesn't really answer our question. Shelo tiritz lo klum. This doesn't answer anything. So what does it mean? This whole idea, that was the question, the original question. Wasn't he embalmed? Ubir davar kachu. This is the way it's explained. Shekol mi shamaniach banim. Anyone who has children, v'don nekilu enu meis, then that person who has children, it's as if he never dies. L'fisha uber yerech imohu ukareya da'avuahu. Since the uber, the fetus, which later becomes a child, of course, is like, the fetus itself is like a limb, a yerech, which is a thigh, of the mother. It's like a limb of her. Now, I'm not sure what the difference between a yerech and a kareya is, because they're both thighs. But anyway, and it's like the thigh or the upper leg of the father, maybe the loins. V'chelik min ha'av klul baben. And therefore, it's like a portion of the father includes the son. Ukishaben b'chayim, so as long as the child's living or is alive and also produces, as gam chelik min aviv haklul bo b'chayim. This then is as long as the ben is living, as long as the child is living, so then also a portion of the father is included in that person's life, the child's life. So specifically Yaakov, Shekol mitaso shlema, he's the only one of the forefathers. When I say forefathers, I mean the three fathers of the, the Avos. They, Avram had Yishmael, so his bed was not complete. Right? Yitzhak had Esav, his bed was not complete. But Yaakov had all 12 tzaddikim, v'kulam tzaddikim, just like it says in Breshit Rabbah. It's 49:4. I'll just read the words here. Shimba Yochai said, anyone who leaves behind a child who toils in Torah is as though he did not die. Okay, let's go on. Kol hama'amid ben tzaddik ki'ilu enu meis. Anyone who establishes a child who's righteous, it's as if that person doesn't die. But zeh dafka ben tzaddik. That's if you leave over righteous people. Aval ben rasha. What happens if your children are not so righteous? Chashub b'chayav kameis. Then he's considered, even while he's alive, as if he's dead. And there's a pasuk in Isaiah chapter 31, verse 3. That's on the last page. It's a little bit cryptic. Now, the Egyptian are men and not God, and their horses are flesh and not spirit, and the Lord shall turn his hand. But this is the important part. And the helper shall stumble, and the helped one shall fall. I'm imagining we're talking about God and whoever he's helping. Can't be talking about God as being someone who stumbles. So we're talking about the father of the human and the child. The helper is the father, and if he's going to stumble, the one who's trying to help will also stumble. That just makes sense. The child will also stumble. Ukashel oizer v'nafel uzar. Just like the one who's helping fell, so too the one who being helped will also fall. Ve'ein bara kazeh mizake abba. So we're talking about the evil one. So therefore the son, like this, does not give any merit to the father to keep him alive. Lefikak amru dafke Yaakov lo mes. That's why it was said specifically about Yaakov, he did not die. Afal pisha chanatu chantuya, even though he was embalmed, mikol makom kishazaro b'chayim, as long as his children are alive, as gamhu chelek mimenu b'chayim, then also a portion of him remains alive. V'davar zeh nirmaz b'smichut zeh, and this is all hinted to in the juxtaposition. What do we say? V'yechi Yaakov, right away. Yaakov lives. Ki al yedei v'yirpu v'yirbu ma'od, right? It was through the great multiplication of his children, as the verse ends with, verse 27, hayazaru b'chayim, that his children would be alive. Therefore it says, v'yachi Yaakov lives, shegamhu b'chayim, that he is also alive. So I think this gives a great, a deeper understanding. I mean, we believe, Am Yisrael Chai. I mean, this is what we're chanting, this is what we're singing, but we have to know it in our kishkes, right? Yaakov had a full bed, it's true, but his children are here today. I know there's a whole war going on in the ideology. I'm not an expert in Islam, but I'm looking into it a little bit. They really, truly believe, like the Christians have this replacement theology, that they're the chosen and we are not. The Islamists believe very much the same thing. The difference is the Christians are coming around. I mean, many are, not all. Many are. You could pray for them. They actually believe that the Torah that we have is from God and it's unadulterated, it is authentic. The Islamists actually believe, because they have no other way to go around it. They have to say it's a lie. See, it's projection. Their whole lives are a lie, and they know it. And therefore, everything around them is a lie. Okay, I don't want to go too much into it, but that's basically, they're convinced that the book that we have, that we call the Holy Torah, is itself a corruption and man-made forgery, just like they live their lives. It's called projection. And I think there are quite a few waking up. There really are. There is some hope. I don't know how big, because it's a lot of numbers. But if we could see it in Christianity, in Edom, which is unexpected, Ishmael actually has more hope than Edom. So, B'ezrat Hashem, we should see a real Geula come soon in our days, a Yeshua, Mamash, a salvation and miracles. And B'ezrat Hashem, because it's not just this war, we're talking about like a 100-year war here, right? This battle that we're going through now, B'ezrat Hashem, he'll show who's boss, who the land really belongs to, which is him, and who he really gave it to, which is us. And B'ezrat Hashem will live here in peace one day, very soon. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Yiboneh, Yiboneh, Yiboneh.